Now, as I said, the ratification debate was in and of itself an extraordinary event. In my own view, it was the most profound political and philosophical debate to take place on such a large scale with so many people represented, more than any other event in history. So, as profound as the Constitutional Convention work was, the principle of compromise and staying till the very end and seeing the whole process through, ratification was even more extraordinary.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Heroes Path webinar, A Republic If You Can Keep It, a primer on the U.S. Constitution. I'm John Fenzel, founder of Heroes Path, and I'm glad that you're here with us tonight. Before we get rolling, just a few things to know. We're recording this session and we'll post the link so you can rewatch or share it with others who couldn't make it. So this is meant to be engaging, it's meant to be informative and worth your time. You know, it occurred to both Jeff and I that as our nation approaches its semi-quincentennial, 250 years since the Declaration of Independence, there may be no better time for this conversation and the founding principles that still hold us together today. A quick word about who we are and why we're doing this. Heroes Path is brand new. It really exists just to develop leaders of character grounded in history, service, resilience, all those things. We do that by connecting all of the lessons of the past to the challenges of the present through webinars like this one, through podcasts, through educational programs for schools and organizations, and through leadership development experiences and curriculums. We believe fervently that leadership isn't just taught, it's discovered through stories and reflection and the voices who have been there before. That's what tonight is all about. So what I'd like to do, if we can, is just introduce our speaker. Tonight's speaker is Jeff Steinberg. He brings more than 40 years of experience in national security policy. He's worked alongside Congress, the military, the intelligence community. He serves as executive vice president of PTB Global Advisors, working with clients in the United States and Japan and Australia, really around the world. And he also teaches national security fairs at the Florida Atlantic University and Florida Gulf Coast University. So he keeps himself busy. This lecture comes from a semester-long course that Jeff teaches on the U.S. Constitution, from the Philadelphia Constitution to ratification and the amendments. As I mentioned in the announcement for this webinar, I've known Jeff for years. He's an extraordinary intellect, a good friend, and any conversation that I have with him leaves me a lot smarter than when I walked in. Jeff, thanks so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Okay, great, John. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. I'm going to switch over to screen share and put the PowerPoint up.
There you go.
Great. Let me start out by saying that both with respect to the Constitutional Convention and more broadly, I have a problem with history. It's really a problem of a tendency that people might have to assume, because historical events have already occurred, that there was no potential alternative outcome. It's kind of like reading a spy novel and jumping ahead to the last chapter and then working your way back. In the case of the Constitution and really the whole American Revolution, the odds of success were frankly always pretty low. In fact, during the bicentennial, the officially commissioned History of the Constitutional Convention was called A Miracle at Philadelphia. It's a great book by Elizabeth Bowen, and I think that she borrowed that quote from George Washington, that for one thing, the whole idea that the American Revolution ended victorious against the most powerful empire on the planet at that time, the British Empire, was in itself a rather unexpected outcome. And a lot went into it, including significant European support, the French and the Spanish, but the Russians, through the League of Our Neutrality, prevented the British from imposing a complete blockade. So many factors went into the victory of the American Revolution against the most powerful military force in the world. And George Washington had to be on an extraordinary learning curve to get there. Secondly, the events leading into the Philadelphia Convention and the convention itself was really not very legal. The Congress gave permission for a meeting to be convened to just modify and slightly alter, really just tweak the existing Articles of Confederation. But we'll see that the people who gathered in Philadelphia had something much more profound in mind. And also, those who wanted to preserve the Articles of Confederation. Collectively, they were referred to as the Anti-Federalists. They were very powerful factions in many of the states, and they made a collective decision to boycott Philadelphia, to not send anybody among the delegation. And frankly, had they not done that, it would have been difficult, if not impossible, for the Philadelphia delegates to draft something so radical, so new, and so beyond what they were mandated to do. And then, once again, the least covered aspect of the entire process was the ratification. The first time that a comprehensive book was published on the ratification debates in the 13 states was only about a decade ago. And that came about because the Wisconsin State Historical Society put up a large amount of money to just go out and collect a lot of the documentation of what had happened in the various states during the ratification debate. There were no centralized notes on what occurred. There were no transcripts. Obviously, there were no videos of the proceedings. And so it was largely people's memoirs, letters, newspapers that published critical speeches. And I think they're up to about 14 volumes now. And so a Yale historian took it upon herself to go through those volumes and give us the first actual account of the ratification process. So all of these things really occurred against all odds. But there was one thing that the founders had going for them, and I want to briefly focus on that by way of a comparison. Now, one of the key players at the Constitutional Convention was a man named Gouverneur Morris. He was part of the small committee that actually drafted the final version of the Constitution, and Gouverneur Morris wrote the preamble. So he was a pivotal player, and I think this quote from him is an indication of the challenges that were brought into the convention in Philadelphia. He said, "The rich will strive to establish their dominion and enslave the rest. They always did, they always will. They will have the same effect here as elsewhere, if we do not, by the power of government, keep them in their proper spheres." So Morris was one of the strong advocates that there had to be a much more powerful central government than what existed under the Articles of Confederation. Now, it happened that Gouverneur Morris was the first ambassador of the United States to France after the ratification of the Constitution and after the first election, when Thomas Jefferson was called back home from France to become the country's first Secretary of State. And so Gouverneur Morris went to Paris as his replacement. Now, because of the role that the Marquis de Lafayette had played as a general in the Continental Army during the American Revolution, Morris and Lafayette were very well acquainted. And back in France, Lafayette, on the eve of the French Revolution, was the head of the National Guard. People who've written biographies of Lafayette have said that he was a Republican when he was fighting in North America, but being from one of the wealthiest elite families of France, when he was back in France, he fell back into being much more of a monarch. And so the monarch had named him head of the National Guard. Gouverneur Morris went to Lafayette repeatedly and urged him to preemptively use his authority to arrest all of the Jacobin leaders. And he said, if a revolution starts in France, I don't care whether people say it will be modeled on the American Revolution. But the fact of the matter is that France is a country of peasant feudalism in the countryside and basically an urban sort of rabble. And if violence begins, it will immediately get out of control. And he reminded Lafayette. He said, look, in North America, we had 150 years to experiment with representative self-government. Yes, it was under the British monarchy, but really up until the very end of the 17th century, there was an enormous amount of independence and freedom to operate. The Massachusetts Bay Colony developed the Sauget Iron Works, one of the most advanced and largest ironworks anywhere in the world. They had local currencies. There were town councils, and even under the royal governors, in many cases, there were legislatures that were elected by the landholding members of the population, all males. And so for 150 years, these habits, the philosophy of self-rule, the experimentation, the intellect, all of these things combined to create the conditions for the American Revolution. It's a whole longer story about precisely how it all came about. But I think one fact underscores what Governor Morris was talking about. The literacy rate in North America, in the 13 colonies at the time of the American Revolution, was over 90%. And people were deeply religious. Each of the different colonies tended to have a sort of predominant religion, but study of the Bible, agricultural journal, a very vibrant public literature of newspapers and pamphlets were really the kind of foundational elements of what made the American Revolution possible. And it was going on for 5 or 6 generations before 1775. And of course, the Jacobin terror in France just tended to underscore exactly how right Governor Morris was about the preconditions, the culture, the educational level, the moral principles that had to be grounded in the population to make something like the American Revolution possible. Now, the American Revolution succeeded against all odds. And one of the difficulties was that the form of government that was established among the 13 colonies, later the 13 declared independent states, was really a very loose confederation of what amounted to 13 semi-sovereign separate states. The preamble to the Articles of Confederation, for example, said, "We the states," and listed all 13 of them coming together to form a union, whereas the federal constitution of 1787 said, "We the people of these United States." The difference between the two was dramatic. During the period of the American Revolution, the Continental Congress had no authority to generate revenue. The generating of revenue largely occurred at the state level, and there was no capacity for taxes and other revenue generating activity. In Europe, Franklin, Jefferson, John Adams were spending a great deal of their time generating private investments, loans from private individuals, wealthy individuals, and European governments to keep the fight going to defeat the British Empire. And so coming out of the Revolution, particularly people who served in the Continental Army felt very strongly that a strong central government, a new constitution had to be drafted that would give the government much greater authority to actually defend the country against what they knew were going to be persistent attacks from European colonial powers, not just the British, but later the French and others, to bring down this experiment in Republican self-government. Now, among the people who were particularly committed to this idea of the need for a stronger constitution, a stronger federal government, were Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. Later, they had a bit of a falling out when Jefferson came back and was an enormous influence on Madison, and Jefferson's opposition to strong central government and large economic expansion cumulatively impacted on Madison. But during the period in the run-up to the Constitutional Convention, Hamilton and Madison were two of the leading proponents of the need to drastically overhaul the Articles of Confederation. And Hamilton was a member of the Continental Congress, and they were able to get authorization to convene a convention in Annapolis, Maryland, which was convened September 14th, 1786. And the whole idea there was to begin the process of looking at ways to strengthen the power of the federal government. Madison and Hamilton wrote a number of papers for the discussion at the Annapolis Convention. But Annapolis was a complete failure because not enough states even sent representatives. And so a quorum was never established, and the meeting pretty much dissolved before it ever actually got started. Now, people with a less intense commitment to furthering the revolution by creating a much more powerful Republican form of government would have thrown up their hands and given up. But Hamilton and Madison and others went back to the Congress, and at the end of the Annapolis Convention, they basically announced that they were going to be reconvening the following May 1st in Philadelphia to continue the work that never even happened in Annapolis. So it was a pretty extraordinary act on the part of the people in Annapolis to not just simply give up. Now, Hamilton is an extremely important figure in the events, particularly that followed after Philadelphia as the first Treasury Secretary of the United States. He was born in Nevis in the West Indies. His father deserted the mother when Hamilton was in his infancy, and Hamilton basically became a kind of a ward of some of the local business families in the West Indies. He had a tremendous gift for business very early on. He's 13, 14, 15 years old, and he was handling the book at one of the large trading companies that was engaging in international commerce in North America, across into Europe. And the local business leaders realized that this was a talent that was too great to waste in the West Indies. They pooled money and they sent him to New York City, where he was to enroll in King's College, what's today Columbia University. He got there just as the revolutionary ferment was really kicking in the early 1770s. He joined the New York militia, and when the revolution broke out, he was an outstanding commander and came to the attention of George Washington, who brought him on as one of his aides-de-camp. And right up until the last several years of the war, Hamilton became George Washington's closest collaborator, to the point that Washington would give a general order. Hamilton would basically write the details and even was authorized to sign Washington's signature on the document. So many of the wartime documents, orders to military commanders that were under George Washington's name were actually written and signed by Hamilton. But Hamilton was a young guy. He was a bit of a hothead, and he didn't like the idea of being a staff officer and sitting out the combat in the Revolution. And finally, Washington relented and made him a battalion commander, and Hamilton went into combat just in time for Yorktown, where he was one of the really effective commanders there in the critical battle that, with the help of the French Navy, encircled the British forces and really brought the war to an end, although it lingered on for quite some time afterwards. After Yorktown, Hamilton basically went back up to New York, got his law degree, and eventually went into the Continental Congress representing New York, and we'll see later the role that he played in the Federalist Papers. Now, it was agreed, Congress gave the authorization for the convening of the meeting in Philadelphia to start on the 1st of May of 1787. Obviously, the revolution had ended. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 established international recognition of the United States as a sovereign country. The British had no intention of simply walking away from it, but they were forced to sign the Treaty of Paris and develop alternative strategies for reconquering. And so from the time of the writing and ratification of the Articles of Confederation, early 1780s, up until the convening in Philadelphia, the United States was going through a process of regionalization. The power of the states over any sort of centralized federal government, which was more like an advisory body, made it very clear to many of the founders that this really had to be changed. And one of the institutions that is not necessarily well known, but played an absolutely pivotal role in Philadelphia, was an organization called the Society of the Cincinnati. This was an organization that was founded in 1784 at the end of the Revolution. And among those who had served throughout the Revolution in the officer corps of the Continental Army, as distinct from the state militias, they decided to basically form a kind of a chivalric organization commemorating their combat together during the Revolution. And they named it the Society of the Cincinnati after the Roman general Cincinnatus, who was a tremendous military commander and was asked to become a dictator. And he refused to do that and instead went back to his farming, which was his career before going into the military service for the Romans. And so the image of Cincinnatus is that of the citizen soldier who's called up to serve and then afterwards goes back to civilian life. Washington himself would have loved to have retired after serving as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army and go back to Mount Vernon and spend the rest of his life experimental farming, but history had other callings for him. So among the states that sent delegations to Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, of the 50 or so delegates who remained throughout and who really did the bulk of the work, 29 of them were members of the Society of the Cincinnati. In other words, they were officers in the Continental Army and served throughout the Revolution. So they came in with a common understanding of the need to form a stronger and centralized federal government. And so this was essential. In fact, the Society of the Cincinnati scheduled their second convention to take place in Philadelphia in May of 1787. Initially, Washington had, even though he was the president of the Society of Cincinnati, he had informed the people that he had no plans to go to Philadelphia. He was busy at Mount Vernon. He was busy tending to his own affairs, his farming and other things, which had really been left in the hands of others throughout the time of the Revolution. And it prevailed on a number of people: Henry Knox, Hamilton, Madison, many others, many people from Virginia, to finally convince Washington that he had to come to Philadelphia to attend the Constitutional Convention. And so ultimately, and it was fairly last minute, he relented. And again, one of the strong arguments was that the anti-federalists were not going to be there, not in great numbers. And so therefore, there was a chance to do something really revolutionary. And so ultimately Washington came. The biggest argument that was made to Washington was that he was the symbol of the nation. He was the commander-in-chief for the revolution. There was no other figure who had the public stature among the entire population that Washington did. And by his coming to the Constitutional Convention, it would give an imprimatur of legitimacy, regardless of how far they were going beyond the bounds of what the Congress authorized them to do. Needless to say, not everybody showed up on May 1st. Travel logistics, other issues, people's personal business, and Washington and the Virginia delegation arrived in Philadelphia pretty much right on time. And of course, the Pennsylvania delegation, led by Benjamin Franklin, already way up in years, late 70s, early 80s, they were already there. And basically, Washington and the Virginia delegates were able to caucus for days and days with the Pennsylvania delegates, and they came up with a kind of a framework that we'll see is what really shaped the events that finally began on May 25th, when enough delegates from 12 states arrived that they actually had a quorum. The first order of business, Washington was elected president to the convention, and rules were set. This was extremely important. Number one, the first rule was total secrecy. And this created a kind of a logistical problem. Philadelphia was going through one of the hottest summers in history. And in order to maintain secrecy, they had to keep the curtains closed in all of the windows. They were meeting at the Pennsylvania Legislative Hall. You see it there in that picture. And they really suffered from tremendous discomfort given the heat and given that there was no fresh air coming in. The other rule was that nothing was final until the final draft was completed. They wanted to reserve the right to continue debate and to basically work through to come up with more perfect formulations. And so nothing that was agreed upon along the way was necessarily final until the final document was drafted and approved by the members of the convention. Now, Washington's role, as I say, was absolutely pivotal. Madison was designated, whether he was appointed or whether he took it upon himself, to take notes. And so Madison was there for every session, took copious notes. They were later published and they're still available. If you want to get a kind of a blow-by-blow, hour-by-hour account of the debate, the extraordinary debate that went on there, then you can read Madison's Notes on the Constitutional Convention. It's a paperback. Like everything else in the world, you can get it on Amazon. Now, there was also a deep collaboration between Washington and Franklin, and it really went back all the way to the 1750s and the beginning of the French and Indian War. What was called the 7 Years' War in Europe was called the French and Indian Wars in North America. And Franklin and Washington were the heads of the militias of Pennsylvania and Virginia. And so they had a number of meetings in the context of the French and Indian War. And basically, they were instrumental in collaboration in creating the first common defense agreements among the 13 colonies. And they also were instrumental in setting up basically the framework for the Continental Congress when it was first convened. This was even before the Articles of Confederation were written. And as I say, Washington arrived with the Virginia delegation early, 2 or 3 weeks before the quorum was reached. And they met every evening with the Pennsylvania delegation and really framed the outlines of what was to happen during the convention. Now, I want to emphasize that there were significant fault lines among those delegations, even though they were all inclined towards agreeing on the need to a stronger federal government. One of the major dividing lines was between the small states and the larger states. And under the Articles of Confederation, every state had an equal vote. And smaller states, Delaware and the others, the larger geographic states in the South, the Carolinas and Georgia, with very small populations, enjoyed a lot of special status under the Articles of Confederation. And so right off the bat, in order to even reach a consensus about the nature of the legislative branch, there was going to have to be compromise. The interests of the larger states could have come to dominate the smaller states, and so the smaller states represented a kind of a block. Obviously, there were fault lines over the issue of slavery and a number of other things. Each of the states themselves were largely divided between urban and rural areas. And so a lot of the anti-tax, anti-federalist, anti-modernization was focused in some of the rural areas in all of the states. And we'll see that's a prominent factor in Massachusetts. But because of the experiences that the colonies had even before becoming states with various forms of self-government, there was an understanding that you would want to establish an executive, legislative, and judicial branch. There was a long history in Europe, the English Constitution, the writings of people like Montesquieu and Locke and others, Leibniz. They were widely known in the colonies because of the high rate of literacy. And so they were not coming into the whole experience of creating a form of government as neophytes. And so there was an understanding of a lot of these issues. Now, there were 2 draft proposals that were presented right at the very beginning of the convention. One was called the Virginia Plan, and the other one was called the New Jersey Plan. Virginia was one of the larger states, and it had people like Madison and Washington who were really strongly convinced of the need for a much more powerful federal government working side by side with the states. New Jersey was one of the smaller states, and so the New Jersey Plan really took up ways to just improve upon the Articles of Confederation, and they certainly were not ready to relinquish the equal voting rights among all of the states. And so much of what happened during the month of June centered on this question of the legislative branch, the powers that would be vested in the legislative branch, and whether each state would have equal representation or whether there would be some kind of proportional representation. This debate almost brought the convention to a screeching halt when it seemed that it was an almost insurmountable obstacle to moving on. And so June moved into July, and this issue was tearing things apart. And at one point, the delegation from Connecticut, which again was one of the smaller states, came up with a proposal, a great compromise, that you would have a bicameral federal legislature, that you would have a House of Representatives that would be based on population and would be proportional representation, and then the Senate, the upper house, would have equal representation. Each state would have 2 senators. For us today, it is something that we've grown up with. But back then, this was the critical obstacle towards moving forward with all of the other issues that would have to be addressed before they would have a real draft constitution. And so the great compromise was put forward by Connecticut. They took a vote on it, and the vote passed. And this was basically one of the absolute critical turning point moments in the whole process. And the convention continued because everyone who was there was in attendance because they were convinced that if the Articles of Confederation were maintained, the United States would collapse. The states would go their own way, and that the European adversaries, particularly the British, would find ways to pick it apart. And so this spirit of compromise was really the defining characteristic, because all of the delegates understood that there was a higher purpose and that nobody was going to get everything that they wanted. The Virginia plan was much more demanding in terms of powers vested in the federal government and the reduction of powers in the hands of the states. And nobody got the full plan as they envisioned. But the great compromise enabled the process to continue. And there were obviously very many other issues that had to be taken up. And one of the critical issues, once they had decided that the House of Representatives would be the body that was proportional, and they ultimately settled on 1 representative for every 40,000 people in the state. The southern states, ironically, wanted all of the slaves to be counted 1 for 1, because in most of the southern states, particularly Virginia and the Carolinas, the slave population was greater than the non-slave population. And so, ironically, the states in the North and the Mid-Atlantic were objected to the idea that there would be a massive amount of power within the House of Representatives vested in the southern states if every slave was counted 1 for 1 as a resident of the state, determining how many people went to the Congress. And so the 3/5 compromise was reached, and that compromise was really related to the composition of the House of Representatives. The issue of slavery was a burning issue throughout the convention, and whether to immediately order the abolition of slavery, had that happened, the southern states would have not voted in favor of the Constitution. There was a wide-held belief that as the country developed, as the economy increased, as roads and canals were built, as bridges were built, that slavery eventually would become outmoded. This was definitely Hamilton's idea when he promoted the idea of the First National Bank. But again, a compromise had to be reached, and so the 3/5 compromise took place, and the issue of slavery was kicked down the road. Constitution provided that 20 years after ratification, there would be no new importation of slaves into the United States. So it was really an issue that everybody at the convention knew would come back again and again. But in order to overcome the hurdle and actually ratify a constitution, they were going to have to make an unpleasant compromise. The word compromise in every conceivable way was a cornerstone of the work that went on in Philadelphia. There were two big concerns that many of the people in Philadelphia had. One concern was to not create a strong executive branch that would mimic a European monarchy. And Article 1, Section 8 gave the sole authority to bring the country to war to the House of Representatives, to the least ruling and the most representative branch of the government. And other authorities, the authority to tax and to generate revenue, was also given to the House of Representatives, so that these issues would be grappled with at the level where there was the greatest amount of representation of every different grouping and every different region and section of the country. So, for example, to this day, the House Ways and Means Committee is the body that initiates all tax and revenue legislation. That power rests in the House, not even in the Senate. And so one concern was presidential power. The other concern was anarchy. And so they really wanted to make sure that, because they had experiences, things like the Great Awakening, where people had been drawn into these very basic populist causes. You had the Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts, a rebellion of Western farmers who objected to taxation on some of the luxury items, largely booze, that they were producing. So the founders were concerned about the issue of too much freedom without a system of checks and controls. And so this balancing act between the two was really a critical issue. The question of the presidency, the powers that would be vested in the presidency, were debated and were not really resolved fully until days before the completion of the final draft of the Constitution in September. And the reason being that there was so much to be done to give the president adequate authority to leave the country, while at the same time placing significant checks and balances on presidential power. And the debates sometimes came down to the question of, what will the president be called? Will he be given an honorific title, something befitting a monarch? And they said, no, the emphasis is that the president is not above the law. He does not have the authority to bring the country to war, and he's a citizen just like everybody else. And so they said the president will be called Mr. President. And there was debate whether there should be a triumvirate representing the three major regions of the country: New England, Mid-Atlantic, and South. And again, these things were debated and votes were taken, and ultimately the decision was made that if you had that kind of triumvirate, there would be a tendency to too much reinforce local, regional interests, and you needed a president to be above all of those local and regional interests. And so they ultimately decided there would be a single president. The House would be elected for 2 years, the Senate for 6, the president for 4. And again, they spent a great deal of time working on restraints on presidential power. They really had a kind of a dual view of man, that on the one hand, there were factors like greed and avarice and power grabbing, but there was also, for the United States, a moral purpose, a higher purpose in which the union and the benefits to be derived from a union taking care of all of the citizens, both current and future, meant that there was also this other side of human beings, that there was a sense of a common bond between those people who call themselves American. And so this kind of duality was something that they debated extensively, and particularly when it came to developing means of restraint on presidential power. As I said, only Congress can declare war. They set out impeachment procedures for removing a president from office. And again, they debated extensively, should there be a kind of a laundry list of specific crimes that would be impeachable? And ultimately, they decided, because they were creating something that was to exist in perpetuity, that they would keep it fairly general. treason and high crimes and misdemeanors. They left the definitions vague. They actually expected that there would be a lot of presidents impeached over the years because they knew that there was going to be this natural impulse on the part of the executive branch to try to usurp powers that were really delegated to the other branches, the legislative and judicial branches. They talk about the president's authority to veto legislation, but also established that Congress could override the presidential veto. And so all of these issues, again, were debated at great length. When they got to about the third week in July, it was concluded that they had made enough progress that they would have a small team of people stay behind and would basically put together a draft of the interim constitution, which was based on the votes that had been taken up till that point. Again, remembering that everything could be rewritten and overturned until the very, very end. And Governor Morris, Hamilton, Madison, several other people, Wilson from Pennsylvania stayed back, and they were on this committee, and they took 2 weeks. The other delegates went back or stayed in Philadelphia attending to other business, and they reconvened right around the beginning of August to carry on the work. And so by this point, they were looking at a kind of a clearly defined structure. And they understood that there had to be points of intersection between the states and the federal government, given the vast amount of power that the states enjoyed under the Articles of Confederation. And basically what they agreed to is that the U.S. senators would be selected by the state legislatures, so that the state legislatures would have an active presence within the federal government by choosing 2 of their own to go to Washington representing the interests of the state, filtered through the ideas and policies of the state legislature. So it was really a kind of federal system that bound the states and the federal government together, that had a system of checks and balances. They had to decide on the ratification process. Were they going to simply send it back to the state legislatures, knowing that there might be a real hidden trap there, given the anti-federalists who in a number of states were really dominant? And they decided that the states would basically elect delegates to a much larger and more open convention. And then they had to decide whether the Constitution had to be ratified unanimously or, on the other extreme, simply by majority. In other words, if 7 states ratified, would that be enough? Or did all 13 have to ratify? And remember, Rhode Island never sent any delegation to the Constitutional Convention. So there were only 12 states represented there. Ultimately, they kind of reached, again, a compromise. 9 states would have to ratify for the Constitution to be approved. And so they also took up the question in the ratification process, what if they come up with better ideas? Should we have a second convention and recast things based on the experience of the ratification debate? They pretty unanimously voted against that. They knew that they had one bite of the apple, and this was it. And they knew that ratification was going to be a challenge. And so ultimately, we get to mid-September 17th, and all but 3 of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention signed the document. 2 from Virginia and 1 from Massachusetts didn't sign, and their answer was pretty straightforward. They said, we're here, we think this is wonderful, it's brilliant, we're not sure if there's maybe something better, and so we're going to just see where things go with ratification. They knew that it was overwhelmingly approved by the delegates in Philadelphia. There was also, very importantly, debate in Philadelphia over whether to include a Bill of Rights, and ultimately they voted that it was not necessary because the preamble to the Constitution made it clear that the role of government was to secure the rights of the current population and future generation, the right to basically the general welfare, the national defense for the current generation and for posterity. And so basically, as we'll see in a moment, it was a good thing that they left that out. And so the Constitution was delivered to the Congress, which was convened in New York at the time. Various of the delegates, including Hamilton and Madison, raced from Philadelphia back to New York to take their seats in Congress in order to participate in the discussion. Ultimately, what the Congress concluded was that it was not their place to vote yay or nay on ratification because the Constitution provided for the state ratification conventions. And so what they did instead is simply agreed to pass on the Constitution draft to the 13 states to proceed with the ratification debate. Now, as I said, the ratification debate was in and of itself an extraordinary event. In my own view, it was the most profound political and philosophical debate to take place on such a large scale with so many people represented, more than any other event in history. So as profound as the Constitutional Convention work was, the principle of compromise and staying till the very end and seeing the whole process through, ratification was even more extraordinary. Now, a few states really stand out. For one thing, the smaller states, because of the great compromise, was basically an advantage from their standpoint. They retained in the Senate the equal status of the larger states. And so in most of the smaller states, the ratification process was fairly quick and either was unanimous or passed by a wide margin. One of the critical issues that also was beneficial to the smaller state was, I mentioned earlier that there was concern about a kind of populist mob phenomenon developing. And so what they agreed to was to create something that had really no precedent anywhere in history, namely the Electoral College, that leading citizens in every state would be elected and they would be the electors responsible for casting the vote for president and vice president. And that process was intended to make sure that the most level-headed people in each of the states had this kind of intermediary role. And so if you think about it, while the smaller states would have fewer members of the House of Representatives, the Electoral College votes by state were made up of the total number of representatives and senators. So the smaller states, even if they had fewer members of the House, all had 2 members of the Senate and therefore 2 electoral college votes. So if you wanted to talk about a pure system of one man, one vote, one person, one vote, that was not what the founders established. It was not a pure democracy. It was a democratic republic in which they looked to leading citizens to serve as a non-hereditary kind of House of Lords. In some of the writings of Hamilton and Madison and Jay, they actually talked about the Senate as this sort of intermediate organization representing the sort of leading aristocratic elements within society to be chosen by the state legislature. So again, these factors gave an edge to the smaller states, recognized that they could be potentially overwhelmed in decision-making by the larger states, and therefore they were given kind of special status. The first big challenge came in Massachusetts, where basically you had a majority of people who really were opposed to the new, stronger central government, particularly the farmers and small businessmen in the western part of the state who had been directly involved in the Shays Rebellion. When the elections occurred and local town meetings elected the delegates to go to the state convention in Massachusetts, in Boston, the breakdown was pretty much even between Federalists and anti-Federalists. And there were some prominent figures within the American Revolution. In Massachusetts, most notably Samuel Adams, who was an anti-federalist. And Massachusetts was really going to be the kind of bellwether whether the Constitution would be ratified or not. And so those who were in Philadelphia, who were part of the drafting of the new federal Constitution from Massachusetts, knew that they were going to have to really use their powers of persuasion. The other person who was really critical from Massachusetts was the Governor John Hancock, who was a kind of a wily political operative. And he knew that basically he was going to be a decisive figure in determining whether Massachusetts ratified or didn't. And he developed a diplomatic illness. He claimed to develop a severe case of the gout and did not attend the convention. And so he was the person who was going to position himself as the ultimate power broker. And so the leading delegates from Philadelphia who were part of the Massachusetts delegation. And one of them, Elbridge Gerry, was one of the three who did not sign the Constitution. He was from Massachusetts. They painstakingly went through all of the articles of the Constitution. And the people who were in Philadelphia basically did an extraordinary job of explaining all of the issues, all of the debates. And over the period of quite a number of weeks, several of the leading anti-federalists, including Samuel Adams, were persuaded by the power of the argument for why this was a superior form of government. And so several of the leading Federalists and Sam Adams went to Governor Hancock. The big issue that came up in the debate in Massachusetts by the anti-Federalists was why there was no mention of the rights of the individual citizens. And so the issue of the need for a Bill of Rights was one of the main anti-Federalist arguments for why the Constitution should be rejected. And so Sam Adams and some of the people who were prominent in Philadelphia went to Governor Hancock and they said, look, here's the situation. You need to endorse the Constitution. You need to be the person who brings it home. And furthermore, the Federalist faction pledges that if Virginia rejects the Constitution, which was also very much of a possibility, that would probably mean that George Washington, being from Virginia, would not be the first president. And so the Federalists pledged that they would support John Hancock as the first president if Washington, who everybody assumed would be the first president, was unable to fill that role. And so the agreement was reached that Hancock would go to the convention, would endorse it with the proviso that the governor and the delegation that endorsed the Constitution would send a letter to the Congress specifying that they wanted guarantees that the first order of business of the newly elected Congress would be to amend the Constitution. They had, in Philadelphia, designed the procedures for how to amend the Constitution because they understood that times would change, the country might change in character, and there would have to be correction because the Constitution was not perfect. And so Hancock made a dramatic appearance in his bedgown, carried on a walking bed, and showed up and made a passionate plea for the delegates to support the ratification of the Constitution. And with about 400 or 500 delegates, I don't have the exact number in my head, it passed by about 10 votes. And basically, the 10 votes that passed it were all people who would come as anti-federalists and had swung over on the basis of being persuaded it was a better form of government. And Massachusetts was really absolutely critical. And a number of other states moved forward. The one state to actually reject the Constitution was Rhode Island. Never quite fully figured out what was their bug, but it was actually the location where the largest slave market in North America was, in Bristol, Rhode Island. So maybe that had something to do with the not wanting a strong central federal government. But anyway, Rhode Island held a general election, no delegates elected. The Constitution was rejected, but they did not follow the procedures set out for doing it, so it was ignored. It came down to there being 8 states that ratified at the point that the Virginia Convention was about to happen. And I'll give you a little spoiler alert. In the interim, New Hampshire ratified between the start of the Virginia Convention and the ultimate conclusion. The 9 states had completed the ratification midway through the debate in Virginia. And again, the Virginia debate was really pretty extraordinary. The leading anti-federalist in Virginia was Patrick Henry, who had been the governor and was a leading figure within the revolution. Give me liberty or give me death. He was a monumental figure. He was probably the best sort of motivational speaker in the whole country. Really could rile up people's passions. He was also adamantly opposed to any moves towards the abolishing of slavery and tried to use that as one of the key levers for convincing the Virginia delegation to vote down the Constitution. And the debate was going on in Richmond. The leading person representing the Federalist faction was Madison, who was by no means an effective public speaker. He was a kind of a shy personality, very legalistic, but he really rose to the occasion. And again, the debate was intense. There was fear even that if Virginia voted by a narrow margin to ratify the Constitution, that there would be forces that would move immediately to secede from the Union. And so the debate in Virginia, again, was of monumental proportion. Ultimately, by just a few votes, the Constitution was ratified. Virginia was the 10th state to ratify. And ultimately, Patrick Henry stood on the steps of the Capitol building and told everybody that the debate had resolved honestly and fairly. There was no cheating. There was no argument to be made, that people debated the issues honorably, and he told the crowds to go home. And so there was no immediate insurrection came about as the result. And so again, February 6, 1788, Massachusetts ratified, Virginia ratified mid-June 1788. And so we got ourselves a constitution. New York came up towards the very, very end, and Hamilton was really in a small minority of pro-federalists within the state. The governor really vowed to maintain the powers that New York, as a major state with the largest import ports collecting the tariff revenues of almost any state in the country, really wanted to keep the Constitution from going forward. Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay took it upon themselves to write a series of essays that were published in the newspapers, not just in New York, but all over the country. And so over a period of months, they wrote something like 86 essays in which they really dove into the details of the issues that were being debated in Philadelphia, how they were resolved, the benefits of all of those developments, and the Federalist Papers' impact beyond just New York, where the Constitution did pass by a narrow margin, something like 2 votes. So if you took the entirety of the votes in the 12 states, ultimately Rhode Island ratified 2 years into George Washington's first term as president. They didn't ratify till 1790. If you take all of those factors into account, as I say, this was an extraordinary public debate on some of the most profound issues of the nature of man, how to govern, how to take advantage of this duality of humans, the impulse towards greed and selfishness versus the impulse towards more universal a kind and virtuous approach. Now, famous quote from Benjamin Franklin. Prominent Philadelphia woman came up to him during the midst of the convention out on the street and said, "What have you given us?" And it's important. She wanted to know, a republic or a monarchy? Because they looked at Europe, they understood all of the downsides of monarchy as a form of government. And so Franklin's famous comment was, "A republic if you can keep it." Now, there's a whole other discussion that could take place on the amendments. There's not that many. A few of the amendments were corrections in the Constitution. Having only one ballot and 2 votes per elector became the case in 1780 that Aaron Burr, who was the vice presidential running mate of Thomas Jefferson, refused to tell one of his delegates not to vote for him on the ballot, so that it would have clearly been the case that Jefferson was president and he was vice president. And so that mistake was corrected in one of the early amendments. Madison understood the importance of a Bill of Rights because by the end of ratification, at least 9 states had sent in their own list of what they wanted included in a Bill of Rights. And it was agreed that as long as the first Congress was pledged to the idea of passing a Bill of Rights, they would not reject the Constitution until it was rewritten to include a Bill of Rights. So Madison saw to it that the Bill of Rights passed during the first Congress. You had major surges of amendments that occurred during critical times in the country's history where dramatic changes occurred. The Civil War, the end of slavery, citizenship for all of the former slaves. 3 amendments were passed in rapid succession during that particular period. The women's right to vote. The first year that women were allowed to vote in the United States was 1920. The women's temperance movement argued that liquor had to be abolished because their husbands were getting drunk on the way home the night they got paid on Friday. And so you had prohibition, which turned out to be a bad idea. And it's the only time that you had an amendment to the Constitution passed and then overturned and canceled in 1933. So we went through that experiment. In the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement and other things related to that were another period. The Kennedy assassination begged the question of presidential succession and what to do if a president survives but is incapacitated. It was known that for the last 18 months of Woodrow Wilson's presidency, he was basically in bed with a stroke and his wife was really running the country. And so after Kennedy was shot, they passed the 25th Amendment, which provided for a means by which president who was physically or mentally incapable of continuing could be removed by an initiative from the cabinet. And so basically the 26 amendments or so that we have really reflected significant changes in the national culture and the development of the history of the United States. They're not frivolous and they're hard to ratify. And so when they occur, they really reflect efforts to bring the Constitution up to date and to modernize its execution. The fact of the matter is that the U.S. Constitution is the longest uninterrupted constitution in human history. The British had the Magna Carta and all of that, but it's not a structure of government with a preamble, with separation of powers, with clear designation of checks and balances between the federal government and the state, between the 3 branches of the federal government. There's nothing like it. France, old country, their current constitution is from the late 1950s. So what we have is something that is, again, completely unique in human history and also reflected this principle that because there was a higher purpose, a higher calling, people who were there were willing to make concessions and compromise. The principle of compromise is the undergirding of our constitutional system. And when that principle is in jeopardy, it tends to be a challenging moment for the country. But we've been through this many times before, and the resilience of the Constitution is a pretty incredible thing that I think justifies calling it the miracle in Philadelphia. So I'm going to stop the share here and open things up.
Well, thanks, Jeff. That was really just amazing. I'll tell you, I was taking copious notes throughout your whole lecture. And, one of the things you just mentioned really just hit home for me, and that was your mention of this higher calling as being the motivation for compromise. And today, what we're seeing is this kind of polarization of society in many respects. And I'm just wondering if possibly we may have lost that sense of that higher calling. And I'm not sure how you get that back. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's got to be embedded in the institutional culture. And I think the fact that civics is something that is not an essential part of the curriculum in many school systems means that we're depriving the young people of having the opportunity to understand what it is that's unique about this experiment in a democratic republic form of government. We're still an experimental country. We haven't reached the end point yet at all. The founders, and Hamilton talked about this in several of the Federalist Papers. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but he and Madison both argued that, yes, checks and balances create a situation where no single branch can become too powerful. But they also argued that there was this common culture and a kind of an aristocracy of ideas that had developed over that 150 years of preparation for the revolution and the Constitution. And from years in Washington, one kind of instance stands out in my mind. I was at an event in Washington. It was an Atlantic Council conference, and the speaker was Chuck Hagel. He was a senator. He was Secretary of Defense. He was a Republican serving in the Democratic administration. And I asked him a question about whether he was concerned that the Constitution, the principles were eroding. And I knew that when he was in the Senate, he was part of a group of about 20 senators, equally balanced between Democrats and Republicans, who saw themselves as the guarantors of the system, that they were going to work together across the aisle. They were going to be the exemplars of cooperation and compromise. And Hagel basically said, you know something? I think that's the best question I've been asked because I worry about that. And he reached into his pocket and he took out a copy of the Constitution. He said, I was given this Constitution by Senator Byrd my first day after being elected and being sworn in as a senator. And he said, you have to keep this close to your heart and you've got to read it constantly and remind yourself what you're here for. So I think that every generation we're producing at least a handful of people who carry that sort of sense of identity. It may sometimes seem like it's a very narrow read that we're relying on, but I think it's still there. And history doesn't repeat itself, but there's cycles that recur. And this is not the first time that we've been in a period of an enormous sort of populist upsurge, dissatisfaction with the status quo. And it's a pendulum. And I think that we, so far, for our 250 or so years, we've tended to have the pendulum run in extremes, but eventually settle into a much more narrow band. And I'm still hopeful and optimistic that process is still there. We've still got it within us. You look at the writings of people from the 1620s right up through to the revolution, and that they really incorporated religious ideas, philosophy of government, all of these things. And it was a rich, debated environment. We've got to do everything possible to encourage that. And I think the project that you're launching is just perfectly timed to take up that very large task.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeff. It's for us, that's the whole motivation behind it. And I think it is that higher calling that we've all got to get back as really a society and as a country. And I agree with you. I'm optimistic too. I think that there's an appreciation that our history is really important, our shared critical past, to be able to inform that higher calling. And it's funny, I always said history may not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme, right?
Yeah, it's exactly.
The other thing, and by the way, if any of our participants have any questions, please just type it into the chat. I can read it aloud or raise your hand. There's a way to do that here on Zoom webinars. It's at the bottom of your screen, so don't hesitate to ask any questions. But I've got lots of other questions too, and we do have a little bit of time left to do this. And it's interesting, a couple of years ago, I went down into Virginia, and just below Fort Belvoir is George Mason's house. And George Mason was one of those guys that held back because he believed that we really couldn't have a constitution unless we had a Bill of Rights, correct?
Correct.
And as a result of that, because of that insistence on a Bill of Rights, he was previously great friends with, in fact, they were almost best friends with George Washington and they were in such close proximity to Mount Vernon. But following that opposition to the Constitution that was contingent on a Bill of Rights, I don't think the two ever spoke again, did they?
I'm not sure that they did, but I do know that he did come around at the Virginia vote. He and Edmund Randolph wound up playing a kind of a critical role in turning back the anti-federalist opposition because Patrick Henry was such an effective rabble-rouser, I guess you'd say. Yeah. And the other irony is that several of the Virginia delegates to the Constitutional Convention were among the most outspoken abolitionists and wanted the Constitution to actually include a firm date for the abolishing of slavery. So the whole idea that this was a strictly North versus South issue is not the case, because there were people who had profound moral concerns about the institution.
And today you go over to the National Archives. We were there in front of it last night when we went into dinner. And you go into the archives, and the first thing on your left is the Declaration of Independence. And then you walk a bit further over, and there's the U.S. Constitution. And then to the right is the Bill of Rights. And so that's really a very good view of what our country is founded on. And without that, I'm not sure that there would have been a constitution without a Bill of Rights. And it's also interesting too, because Rhode Island, you mentioned that they ratified the Constitution late 1789, I believe, 1790. And yeah, and because of that, there were a lot of passions. And I'm not sure that this is in anything you're going to find in any books you find on Amazon. George Washington was pretty upset with Rhode Island as well. In fact, he refused to visit during a trip that he was taking to New England until they ratified it. And they finally did, and he finally did go over there, and they all made amends, and he said good things about Rhode Island, but he wasn't happy with the fact that they were the very last holdouts, was he?
No, not at all.
It's really just a fascinating time. There were lots of emotions that were running rampant during that time. Jeff, let me ask you another question. What lessons from the Constitutional Convention do you think are most urgent for America today? You mentioned compromise. Anything else?
I just think that, compromise overwhelmingly, but compromise based on, again, a higher set of principles, that you have a shared objective that matters more than your specific interest alone. The other thing is that I think that the concern that the founders had, and why the last issue to be resolved of any really major importance, was the checks and balances on the power of the presidency. I think that this is something that really warrants a continuing debate and discussion, because there very clearly has been a significant expansion of presidential power, particularly the authority to bring the country to war. And I think that's an issue that we're going to be grappling with for a very long time. The temptations of the office of the presidency. I think the other thing that was left more vague was the role of the judicial branch. It was very clear that the judiciary was to be a critical constitutional check and balance on both the executive and legislative branches. And that's why Supreme Court justices, all federal judges, were appointed for life, with the idea that they would be completely free from the political pressures and prejudices. And I think that, again, it's an institution that was really shaped and molded by some of the early giants who sat on the court, obviously John Marshall being first among all of them. So I think that these are continuing issues that we need to be looking at and reviewing, and you don't necessarily want to be strict structuralists that if the founders didn't say it in their own words, it's really unfair to put words in their mouth. But I think the issue of presidential power and the expansion of it is the single thing that worries me the most.
It's interesting, because that was my next question for you. What do you think would our founders say today? How would they view today's constitutional amendments and debates? And what would they say today about the potential dangers of an imperial presidency?
I think they'd be greatly alarmed, and they'd say, hey, read Article 1.
Yeah.
There's a reason why we put the legislative branch first. It's the most representative, it's the most unruly, and we do not want a situation where you have a monarch above the law who can bring the country to war. We don't want one person to be able to bring our country to war. And I think that we have a history that's made up of several things. We have the laws, we have the Constitution, we have the laws that are passed by Congress, but then we also have the precedents that have been set by great leaders. Washington set the precedent, number one, of retiring after 2 terms. And really, I think that Cincinnatus principle that he was a farmer at heart and he really cherished the years that he had post presidency to concentrate on what he was doing at Mount Vernon. And that was something that was really critical. But the other big precedent he set was delivering a farewell address that was not an episode of patting himself on the back for all the good things he did. It was looking ahead and worrying about the things that were left unsaid. And so the 2 things in his farewell address, which is really worth reading in its entirety, were concerns about the rise of political parties and factionalism and things divided the country. And the second thing that he was worried about was foreign entanglements. And that was something that was reinforced later by John Quincy Adams when he was Secretary of State and then afterwards as president. On the 4th of July, 1811, John Quincy Adams delivered an address before a joint session of Congress that was really a comprehensive history of how we got to where we were at that point, how the revolution happened. And his big famous quote was, "We do not go overseas looking for monsters to slay." And that was a fundamental point of George Washington. And so I think the other element of the history of the great statesmen, and that's another part of our story as a nation that really needs to be told and retold to really have a sense of who we are and why it is that 250 years later, we're still a work in progress.
Yeah, we are. And that's a reminder too. And a lot of people focus on the Declaration of Independence, 1776, and we mentioned we're approaching our 250-year anniversary. But I think just as important was the ratification of our Constitution, because without that, we wouldn't be a nation.
Exactly
have
right.
the endurance and the resilience that we've had so far. I think that, just as my own kind of editorial comment, I think the one thing that our founders would be really proud of is that we've lasted this long.
Yeah, that's right. Franklin at one point said, "I'm hoping this Constitution holds for 2, 3 generations." So we're way beyond that.
We've done all right.
Yeah.
And how do you use the Constitution to continue that enduring set of values that really articulate? I think those values that are both in the Declaration of Independence, but then also importantly in the Constitution, are just as important today as they were when they were ratified, right?
Absolutely. And think of it as like an accordion, it's flexible.
Yeah,
So
love that.
we made through the amendment process, we've brought the Constitution itself into the 21st century. We've problems that the founders could not have even foreseen.
Right.
It came up later, were addressed. And generally, the amendments are an impressive continuation of the living process of constantly making and reevaluating and expanding the Constitution. In 1976, the Bicentennial Commission, as I said, commissioned this miracle in Philadelphia. There was another group that was advocating for a new constitutional convention, saying that nothing can last forever. The world is so different now than it was from the time of the founders. And the question that immediately came up was, okay, who's going to be there? Who's the George Washington? Who's the Benjamin Franklin? Who's the Madison? Who's the Hamilton? And then many of the others who made it happen. Do we have that caliber of leadership that's capable of being locked in a hot room for 5 months and come out with something better. We can't do something better. Let's keep going with what we've got.
One of the things I was thinking about when you talked about that hot room at the Constitutional Convention was, man, if they had air conditioning, I think that the debate would have gone on a lot longer.
Yeah, I know. We've been going home for Christmas.
That's right. So I think there's probably a great incentive for them to resolve their differences and to compromise just based on the heat. When of course, we know what the heat is like here in the Mid-Atlantic.
Yeah.
I can only imagine what it was like then.
Yep.
Jeff, I think we'll start wrapping up. I'm just really grateful, and I know all of us are, for your just incredible presentation. But before we do wrap up, I wanted to provide everybody with a few updates on Heroes Path. We've got some podcasts, and Jeff, we've talked before. In fact, we just had lunch down in West Palm Beach the other day, and we talked about this, but our podcast program is in addition to this webinar program. And the webinars, we drill down a little bit further. We can spend more time talking about specific issues. But coming up here in the next month, we've got new episodes that are going to be featuring Chloe Gavin. She's the daughter of General Jim Gavin. And so that's really going to be a fascinating conversation. We've got Alex Rowe, who's a grade school teacher. He's the son of Colonel Nick Rowe, who was the author of 5 Years of Freedom. He was a POW who escaped captivity during the Vietnam War. And then we also have George Strawn Hayes. He's a great historian out of the UK. He's a strategist and he's a senior leader from the company One Brief. So we're going to be hearing from all of them in the month of September and lots more that are going to be coming up in October as well. We're now partnered with Wreaths Across America. You've heard of Wreaths Across America if you've ever laid a wreath on Wreath Day in December or picked up wreaths in January. But they're going to be picking up our podcast and their webinars through their radio network. And then we're going to be talking to them about the wreath program. If you purchase wreaths for Arlington National Cemetery through Heroes Path, that's going to be supporting our mission directly. I'm going to be on Wreaths Across America radio on Monday, September 8th at 1 o'clock for the official announcement of that. So we'll try to post that as well. But our new website is going to be launching soon. We've been working on that really hard, and it's going to have these replays of our webinars, podcast archives, and details about our upcoming membership program for those who want to get more involved with Heroes Path. So we're really grateful to all of you, our listeners and our participants. You're the people who have signed up early for this, and we're very grateful for that. Jeff, thanks very much for sharing all of your time and your expertise with us tonight, having you back on with us again. Jeff, as you're going to find out, he has no shortage of topics that are well worth exploring in the future. Look at your inboxes for replay links and stay tuned for any announcements on future webinars as well. So Jeff, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Yeah, it's just good to be with you all. Thanks very much, and we'll see you soon. Take care.